CPS called on me.
All right. We'll go Andrew and then Michael for the order.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
Just in case anybody was wondering, Andrew was scooped twice.
It's true.
Scooped how?
Oh, that was last week whenever I was trying to pick a movie for
Oh.
episode 400.
Yeah.
Got scooped.
Got scooped twice.
You had a good pick eventually, though.
Yeah, it was a good pick. Glad we had it on there.
All right. Here we go. In 3, 2, 1. And welcome to episode 401 of Cinematary. I'm your host, Zach Dennis, and I'm here with
Andrew Swafford.
Michael O'Malley.
In today's episode, we'll be talking about movies that we saw this week in part 1. And in part 2, we will be kicking off our series on Gregg Araki with his 1992 film, The Living End. Real quickly, if you missed if you're just jumping in or you missed last week's episode, we hit 400 last week. Had a fun little group together episode. So that's
My wife listened to it and said our jokes were actually funny this time. So
Wow.
what a compliment. Thank you.
yeah,
Thanks, Rebecca. Our jokes were actually funny this time. That's
a
all I can
paraphrase.
Make that compliment hurt. Yeah.
She had a less direct way of saying it, but I'm paraphrasing.
But I'm gonna ask later, like which jokes landed for her and which ones didn't, because that will make me curious. But
Could your wife re-listen and make a tally of who
I want to
made
know
her
what
laugh the most?
She
I mean,
liked
it
it
was
when
me.
Jesse said that Greatest Showman was a magician movie.
It wasn't a joke.
I don't think that was a joke.
That wasn't a joke. That was she just was misinformed.
No. We're gonna play that off as intentional.
All right. Well, that sounds good. All right. Well, let's jump in. We got 2 new releases and 2 hotly talked about. We're getting into the discourse. Yeah, we're getting in the discourse, everybody. Let's kick it off with the latest from Robert Eggers. That is The Northman. This is as some refer to as Viking Hamlet, even though it came before Hamlet in terms of like the Scandinavian folktale. It stars Alexander Skarsgard, Nicole Kidman, Ethan Hawke, Anya Taylor-Joy, Willem Dafoe, Bjork,
yeah,
all the folks. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I know we're a pretty
Nicole Kidman is in there.
Yeah. I feel like we're a pretty pro Robert Eggers podcast, but what did everybody make of The Northman? I'm gonna start with Andrew since The Witch is, a lot for you.
Yeah, my love of The Witch runs deep. It was the first movie that I ever published an essay about on Cinematary.com, though it was actually just a reformatted letterboxd review at the time. But I love that movie a lot. It's one of my favorites. I actually teach that movie right now. I teach it alongside The Crucible as like a counterpoint to like different ways of talking about early American society and superstitions about witches and gender and things like that. And I liked The Lighthouse a little bit less, but I still enjoyed it. I felt like it was a bit of a swirl, a miasma. It did not have like the same like tightness and tautness that The Witch did to me, but by design, I think it's trying to like capture this feeling of people sort of getting lost in time. And The Northman is doing a kind of a different thing structurally as well, where it's like a much longer movie. It's adapting a saga. I think that's the technical term that medievalists use for talking about this particular type of folktale. And the length was kind of a struggle for me in this movie, to be honest. Like this is my least favorite Robert Eggers movie. I still like it. I would like to talk about all the things I like about it, but the main drawback that keeps me from loving it is just how thinly plotted it is for how long it is. So to give a little bit of context, I read the myth, the saga of Amleth before I watched the movie. And I actually was assigned to read it in college whenever I was studying Hamlet. But I'd forgotten everything about it. I wanted to read it, refresh my memory. And in the version of that I printed out, That story was about 12 pages. This movie, which is, again, 2.5 hours, I would say adapts like 20% of that 12 pages. The plot, the number of plot beats you could really count on one hand. And I think one of the things about a saga, and I'm, again, not a medievalist, not an expert here, but just kind of like based on my read on that story when I read it, is that they are kind of stories that are structured differently than like a lot of modern Western stories. You know, they're not just about like one conflict and one resolution. It's like, and then this happened, and then this happened. So like, to give you an idea, Shakespeare's Hamlet, which is an adaptation of that story, as Zach alluded to, it ends halfway through the Scandinavian legend. And then there's a whole other story after that. So there's just so much to this story, and there's so little of it on the screen. And I'm not saying necessarily that I wanted all of those things to be on screen, because a lot of them did feel extraneous or, you know, not particularly meaningful, not like on theme, right? But what we have here is just like very little, in my opinion. The small parts of it that do feel really like thematically potent to me, or like really, really exciting, I love. But the movie as a whole feels a little bit like a slug to me. And that's a shame, because like there's so much here that I do like, and the actors are so delightful. Like I love seeing Bjork on screen again for the first time since Dancer in the Dark. Willem Dafoe is the freakiest he's ever looked in this movie. Like, I think that Robert Eggers is the like the greatest photographer of Willem Dafoe. Like, Willem Dafoe's big speech in the lighthouse is like maybe the perfect encapsulation of like him as an actor. And then here, I don't want to spoil what happens with this character. He's only in like 2 or 3 scenes, but the last scene he shows up in is amazing. Like, people who have seen this movie know what I'm talking about. Like, you thought that Willem Dafoe's presence on screen could not get stranger, and it does. So I really liked that about it. Really liked the way they handled the violence in general, but I've been rambling for a long time. Michael, what were your thoughts about it?
Well, I agree with the positive things you said. I actually didn't think it was a slog. And I was kind of expecting to think it was too long, because I was looking at the runtime, and it was like, it's like 2 hours and 20 minutes or something. It's pretty long, although I guess it's standard for like big budget cinema these days. But
it is a studio movie.
It is, yeah, it is a studio movie. And it definitely feels more conventional than like certainly The Lighthouse and The Witch 2. And I like those 2 movies better as well. But I actually was really surprised. I saw this on a Friday night, like 9:30 or 9:45, or it was something really late. And I was expecting to be like, okay, I'm going to have to, you know, amp myself up to stay awake through this. But I actually found it really engaging. Just on like a, you know, I was just entertained or intrigued by what was happening on screen at most moments. And I agree that there's not much plot, but I don't know, like everything just looks cool. I know this is like a fairly like surface level thing, but like there's just always like hardcore things happening. Like it's just like, you know, there is not a lot of plot beats, but there is a lot of viscera per minute in this movie. And I think that accounts for a lot, at least in terms of the kind of movie that this is, which is, like, as you said, like mostly like a fairly thinly plotted revenge saga, in which you know that there's going to be lots of blood and death. And there is lots of blood and death, and it's not like particularly surprising along the way, although there is like one twist kind of like 2/3 of the way through that I think is pretty interesting. But for the most part, it's the kind of movie where a lot of the intrigue is foreshadowing things that you know are going to happen, and you're excited to see them happen. Like, for instance, this isn't really a spoiler, but the climax of the movie takes place within a volcano, and like you've seen that volcano erupting in the background for like the past hour, and you're like,
the first shot of the movie is the volcano.
Yeah, and so you're like, when's that volcano coming? When's that volcano coming?
Chekhov's volcano.
And you know, like, okay, the volcano is going to be involved in the climax somehow, and it is. and
In a
it's
great way.
involved in like the most like pulpy, like video gamey way, but it's just cool. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I just thought like, I don't know, man. Like I agree that there's not a ton in terms of like, twisty plot, but the plot beats that are there, it sells the hell out of it for me, and I was thoroughly entertained. And I also think there's like some interesting themes going on that are maybe not like, as naughty as The Witch or the Lighthouse, but it's still an interesting movie, especially on the margins. There's just weird stuff going on in this movie that maybe we can
the
talk
like
about.
Folklore stuff, like the mythology of their
Yeah.
world, is kind of relegated to the margins of the movie, and that was often the most interesting stuff to me. Like anytime you got the shots of the tree, or Bjork's oracle character, or the Valkyrie that he has a vision of him ascending to heaven or to Valhalla with.
That's the stuff I dug. I was like, let's get more of that.
Yeah.
Like
that's certainly the best like stuff in the movie, like the weird stuff, the early like shaman sequence with Willem Dafoe, where like it's kind of like a coming of age initiation, right, for the character who will become the grown Alexander Skarsgård.
Right.
Is very freaky and weird and funny in a way that feels familiar to like old Robert Eggers movies. But also like there is something kind of interesting going on in the sense of giving us a story in which we understand the conventions of the plot, but having it filtered through a worldview that is like entirely steeped in like this kind of like ancient mythic folkloric thing. And so it's like it's like someone from Norse, like, or not Norse, from Iceland or wherever, saw a modern movie and decided to make their own modern movie. And I think that is like really interesting.
Yeah. This is a thing that I like about Robert Eggers in general, and it's kind of come into clearer focus with this movie than it was before. Because I don't know if The Lighthouse is doing quite the same thing. But because he's somebody who's like primarily interested in history, it seems, and like accurately representing history on screen in a way that it often isn't, because we usually like kind of we change the way that history is depicted in order to kind of satisfy a more modern sensibility, or a more modern like ideology, right? Robert Eggers seems to understand that like people in history operated upon different paradigms than we do, and so he's like showing you what is real to those characters, right? So in The Witch, he is representing all the things that the Puritans believed in as if they were literally true. And in the Northman, he is like presenting a story that is completely like, it has sort of blinders on and is completely like focused on the like ideological proclivities of like this Viking culture, right? But I know there's enough stuff like on the margins of it to make you notice the flaws, like the really, really egregious violence against like children and stuff that kind of like just gets tossed aside. I think is there to give you pause. But for the most part, we're kind of locked in to this perspective.
I think too, though, like that's one of the things that's really interesting about reading ancient literature is those things that the story itself doesn't seem to think is very interesting because they're just kind of baked into the worldview, but stand out like really like, blaringly to modern readers. Like Andrew, I know you're aware of the recent translation of the Odyssey that changes all the terminology that's been traditionally translated in English as like servants or whatever into slaves, because that being like the historical context that like Odysseus, like, a lot of the servants and things that he was dealing with are actually just like enslaved folks from like whatever various conquests. And that is just kind of like a normal part of like the understanding, like an assumed part of the world. And you get that in this movie too, that in ways that are really interesting, like the like purely subjective morality of the world in which like you can go sack and rape like another town, but when it happens to you, it is this cataclysmic like moral failure that must be avenged. And the movie like shows that in a way that feels true to old stories where I know that this is not an ancient Greek myth, but like I'm most familiar with like the like Homeric myths or whatever. Like, so for instance, like Odysseus, is so mad that like the suitors are mistreating like his family and his household, that he like massacres all these people and then massacres the slaves in his house who sided with these other people. Like
Right.
in some ways, like standing out to modern readers is like the brutality of like Odysseus, even though that's not really calculated within the morality of like the ancient Greek um, perspective of the story. It's just like an assumed part of like the moral calculus of it. And like in a way, this movie works under the same way, where like you see the opening sequence, involves like the pillaging of the protagonist's town. And then the very next sequence is like 10 years in the future, in which the protagonist has grown up and he is like part of a band of like Viking berserkers doing the exact same thing that we just saw happen to him, but it is presented in really morally neutral terms, right? There's no like, it doesn't really shy away from the brutality of what that is, but it also doesn't imbue it with like, this is the center of the plot because it is moral indignity. And I think that that's really interesting that the movie just kind of commits to that in a way that feels like preserving that feeling of watching something from outside of your own time.
Yeah, I think that like where he places the camera has a lot to do with that. Like whose perspective is being centered is like literally who's in the center of the frame, right? And that that like berserker raid sequence you're talking about is like this long tracking shot where you're just following Alexander Skarsgård's character, but like in the corners of the frame you see like women and children being like carried off and killed and things like that. But like you said, that stands out to a viewer who's not from that time, but that's not the story we're telling. We're telling his story and like kind of not necessarily to empathize with it, but like here's how people in this time period thought of themselves, right? He gets his happy ending.
Yeah, and I think the movie is pretty nihilistic, like in terms of like we as viewers, like it's a pretty nihilistic story about how this worldview just kind of like grinds people into like oblivion, like that.
It keeps him from having like what we as a viewer might think of as true happiness, right? He kind of has a choice near the end of the movie. Do I want to, go off and have this family with Anya Taylor-Joy, spoiler alert, or do I want to continue to pursue, this endless quest for vengeance? And where is that going to lead me?
Zach, what do you think? We've been talking a long time.
Yeah.
Both sound fun.
Both do sound fun.
Endless quest for vengeance, Anya Taylor-Joy.
I think I'm probably closer to Andrew. I would say this is probably my least favorite Robert Eggers movies as well. But still I'm positive on all three. I was thinking about it today. I was listening to him talk with Marin, and it was a good conversation. But I mean, he's pretty open with the fact that the story for the most part is thin, at least like in the movie. Like he's because the way they got into it was they were talking about Robert Eggers said that he was really into comic books and things like that, and then he did like. This ties into just like what he wants to do with filmmaking, but he like did a play and got really into Nosferatu, and that like ruined everything for him. And so after he did that, he like pivoted into like art history and like.
Well, he was going to do an adaptation of Nosferatu after The Witch, and then it got put on hold, and then it was going to happen after The Lighthouse, and it got put on hold, and then people thought it might happen after this, but he said it's not the next.
Yeah, and he said in Marin's podcast that like it's still kind of just in a holding pattern, I think. But it was just funny because like he just ditched comic books and did and kind of like got into other stuff, and like he was talking about, he's like, this is kind of, it has that archetype where it's the story is super basic, and he's like, that's kind of the point. The point is it's supposed to be basic, and then you have all of these auxiliary elements that are just crazy. Like you have these performances, and you have these visuals, and you have these like this kind of mythology. And so to me, I was kind of going in, I honestly, even before listening to it, I was kind of going in on that level. I'm like, the story is whatever. I want to kind of be engaged on those different levels. And I think for the most part, I was pretty engaged. Nicole Kidman is like swinging fucking firing 100-mile-per-hour fastballs down the middle. Like I'm just like, damn. Like,
we need more Nicole Kidman. Like on the list of things that I would have liked more of in this movie.
Like Nicole Kidman emasculating men with her like long speeches. Like that
Like,
is
yeah,
a
or
subgenre
like
that
is she like the Nicole Kidman character is the part of the movie that I feel like I have the least amount of grasp on. It seems like every scene
I get her.
she is presenting a different motivation, and sometimes in the middle of a scene she will kind of change her motivation.
No, she strikes me as one of those like she's just out here trying to save her skin, you know, like she's constantly out here like, I don't care who's at the charge, but I would like to be at the charge there too. That sounds good. But like, so all the like the performances are great. I really liked Alexander Skarsgård. He's like 6'4", 6'5", and he just has like this very like hulking presence. But it's not like you think of like the Marvel suit people like Chris Hemsworth and Chris Pratt and people like that, and Chris Evans, who kind of have like this very like body chest, and like and Skarsgård's like kind of tall and like
he hunches
and hunchy,
and that's like a thing for the berserkers, I think, right? They kind of walk like cavemen. They have like these wolf hoods,
and that's what
on.
makes it so like that's what makes him so interesting in this movie, because he's just like this insanely tall, buff, strong, just kind of hunched over, like he almost kind of has like this creature quality to him that just is really interesting the entire movie.
There's a lot of howling.
There is a lot of howling.
One scene in particular where they're like gearing themselves up for battle is them like probably 5 minutes just howling.
Oh yeah, and I love that. I loved when the kid version and Ethan Hawke are just naked on the ground, like howling at stuff. Like, it's great. Like, I like this.
Just like dudes being dudes.
Dudes being dudes. But yeah, I feel like, to me, I would have leaned into more of like the mythology. Like I wanted more of like that side of things, because
that's such a good part of The Witch.
Because I think you can just like, because the story is so thin, like just make everything else psychedelic and just go fucking nuts. You know, it's just like you have 2.5 hours. The story, people are on board with the story. This dude is trying to get revenge. We understand that. We've seen every revenge movie. We've seen Kurosawa. We're good to go. But it's just like there's no like, you know, there's no psychedelia to it. There's a little bit, but at least I
what is kind of psychedelic that I thought was super cool? All of the nighttime cinematography. Anytime Alexander Skarsgård is just skulking around in the middle of the night, trying not to get noticed, killing people or whatever, it's shot. I don't think it's in black and white, but it's about as close as you can get to black and white in color, right? It has this like deep silvery tone to it.
Yeah, it's like the moonlight.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I don't know. Overall, I recommend the Northman. I think everybody here would recommend the Northman. So it's worth it's worth checking out. It's a fun time.
I will say I remember seeing The Witch in a theater and walking out and hearing the grumbles from the people around me about like how they didn't like the movie. And I walked out of the Northman and I could hear people talking around me too, but they were not grumbles. Like, people were into it. Like, I don't know how this is playing with like a completely wide audience, but my theater was, 1, very full, and 2, into it. Like, it was a good crowd movie.
Yeah, people see. I think this one will probably play better with a lot of folks compared to the other 2 he's made. Well, let's go ahead and jump into a movie that is a wide spectrum of feelings and emotions.
Yeah, talk about the opposite of a plot that is too thin.
Exactly.
About the same length too.
Yeah. Let's talk. I talked about it a little bit a couple weeks ago, but let's talk more in depth on Everything Everywhere All at Once. Michael, I'm gonna start with you on this one, because I mean I talked around this movie 2 weeks ago, so I'll be curious to hear other people's thoughts, and then we can kind of bounce off of them.
Yeah, my take is sort of the opposite of what I just said with the Northmen. Well, in one particular way, which is that this movie is too long, like way too long. Like, this is a 90-minute movie that is 2 hours and 20 minutes long. And otherwise, I'm like mostly positive on it. Like, I really like the component parts of this movie, but what ends up happening eventually is that it feels like those component parts are like cycling the drain and just repeating over and over and over again. And I was very tired of it by the end. But that said, there's some really good stuff. So I guess you kind of talked about it last time, but I'll kind of like briefly explain for listeners who are not tuning in to the episode with the funny jokes this time. So this is about a family, and they own a laundromat. And at the beginning of the movie, it's kind of clear that they're like living this life of drudgery. The mom and dad are about to get divorced. The mother's father doesn't seem like he's doing too well health-wise and needs some sort of care. And the mother's daughter, I should look up the characters' names because I'm blanking on them now. But she is kind of estranged from her mother and is like, kind of, you don't get me, mom. She's a lesbian and is having a hard time with the fact that her mother won't really admit to the grandfather that she has a girlfriend. But this all changes when she is told that she is part of this like huge plot over a multiverse, like an infinite number of multiverses, where this like sinister force is like kind of taking over the different universes, and so she has to like learn how to like switch between the different universes, and you do so by doing really outlandish random stuff and seeing where you land. For some reason, this is what like causes you to switch universes, and I thought it was really fun. There's a lot of really fun stuff. You saw Swiss Army Man. This is like very much the same speed in terms of like this really wacky physical sense of humor that is very driven by kind of really committing to random bits of like what feels like came out of like improv sessions, but like committing to it to the point where you have like full special effects with these things. And I thought that was like really fun. And you get just some like really fun stuff from the one-off universes, like a universe where everyone has hands that are hot dogs and they start spewing mustard when they're aroused or something, or like a universe where this woman is like a dancer or a singer, I guess, and things like that. And like there's so much energy in this movie that and is so committed to the bit that I really like that. There's some stuff in this movie that is so funny, I thought, and I thought all that was great. It also has this kind of emotional core where it's about, how do you find meaning in life? Because this woman's living this life of drudgery. She has to go get audited by the IRS, and that's kind of a major plot in this. And of course, the IRS is just like a big old building full of just like office drones who like know nothing but procedure and are just kind of like bored and hate themselves.
As opposed to the real IRS,
for all I know, those guys are rock stars. I've never actually met anyone from the IRS. So
my dad used to work for the IRS, actually.
And I've never met your dad. For all my
I'm sorry, Andrew.
rock star. But anyway, like, so the beginning of this movie shows everyone in this like drudgery, and then they're thrown into this extremely chaotic situation in which like the monotony of their experience is disrupted by showing that their routines are all like this kind of arbitrary functions of this huge chaotic world that doesn't make sense whatsoever. And so you kind of have this like existentialist like conundrum of like, well, how do you live in a world that is absurd but also requiring you to do like really monotonous tasks in spite of that absurdity? And I always like it when movies kind of like dip their toe into that sort of thing. And I think this movie like ultimately lands in a good place with that. But it just takes so long to get there. Like, I think that this movie really could be cut down easily because it's not like the individual pieces take long. It's that we get to a point where you start seeing the beats repeating. Like there is like the climax of the movie involves one character trying to convince the other character that beauty and spontaneity and a sense of play in the world is what like creates meaning. There are no rules because the universe is absurd, and so the meaning that you find in the universe is based on your ability to find enjoyment in the universe, based on spontaneity and like silliness. And that's like a good idea, but we see so many like back and forths in this dialogue that is like spanning universes, and it's just exhausting. And like honestly, by that point in the movie, you're not even seeing new universes. You're just seeing,
there's like 4 that they keep cycling between.
Yeah, you're just seeing them kind of reiterate, and like it would be so easy to cut probably like 20 minutes from this movie if you just make that climax shorter. and that movie becomes just way more serviceable. But I like this movie overall. I just was tired by the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my thoughts. I don't really like the Daniels. I didn't really like Swiss Army Man. I don't really like this. But I feel bad about not liking both of those movies for different reasons. Like Swiss Army Man, I felt bad not liking just because everybody in my immediate circle was just like in love with it. And I felt like I was just being mean by like, shitting on their fun. And I kind of feel a similar way with this, but I more feel guilty that like I can tell that so much work was put into this movie. Like
a lot of work.
Every minute of this movie has just like tons and tons and tons of cuts to like different worlds and different crazy special effects that you would never expect.
There is one shot, or I guess it's like dozens of shots, but there's like one like maybe 20-second span in the movie that must have taken days to film because it's just this woman in like 36 contexts that you just see like whip past the screen like at lightning speed, and it is really apparent how hard everyone worked.
There's like full wuxia / the Matrix fight scenes with like good choreography and minimal cutting, and there's just like crazy CGI extravaganzas that I cannot like begin to imagine how long they took to make and how many people were required to put them together. But it just wears me out. Like there's just too much. I'm sorry, everything all at once might be a little too much for one movie. IMO. I have to quote this Letterboxd review from a reviewer that I'm not familiar with otherwise, but it's a longer review, but the first couple of sentences are, enjoyed the first hour or so, then felt totally beat up and exhausted. Felt like someone saying, "I love you" in super slow-mo for the last 80 minutes. A classic case of if everything is awesome, then nothing is. And that is exactly how I felt about it. Like I was laughing at the jokes consistently for like the first 30, 45 minutes. And then I just stopped laughing at the jokes, and it never really pulled me back in because like it's the same joke over and over. I'm not saying that it's like the exact same setup punchline or the exact same like running gags or whatever. Though there are a lot of running gags that I do think wear out their welcome. I think that like just the basic ethos of the jokes is always like, bet you didn't expect that. That the way that the world is set up in this movie, like Michael said, the way that people hop universes, they have to do something that would be so unexpected in their universe that it like breaks the matrix, right? And so it's just 2.5 hours of people doing random XD shit. And I just stopped finding it funny after a certain point, and it became very draining. And even though I do kind of agree with like the thematic concerns of the movie, and I do admire that there's an emotional core here, and I am glad that this movie is doing so well. I mean, I want more original movies like this in multiplexes, and this is certainly original. I just didn't really enjoy it that much. And I don't think it's bad necessarily. If you enjoy this movie, I don't want to ruin your fun. It was not very fun for me after a certain point.
I do think like maybe that sense of exhaustion is kind of like inherent in like what the Daniels seem to be interested in doing, which in both this and Swiss Army Man like involve them coming up with an absurd bit that might be like a cutaway gag in another context, but then just like
making
not
that the
letting
whole
go
movie.
of that. Yeah, like of course, like Swiss Army Man is about like, what if a corpse was like all these functions, like it could fart and turn into a motorboat and stuff. And that's the whole movie. And this, like, there's just like some of these jokes they force to stick around so long that they're not funny, and you have to find like the emotional core in them. And some of that works and some of it doesn't. Like there's like a recurring bit with a raccoon, and at first it's like a funny joke, and then
one of the funniest jokes in the movie.
Yeah, it's actually it's like very hilarious. But then
it comes too late for me to really enjoy it though. I'm already worn out by the time we get there.
But then it just keeps going, and eventually, like they try to like wrap it into the emotional core of the film, and like there's an audacity in that where they're just like daring you to, okay, we kept this joke around so long that like the humor is worn off, so now you have to find something else in it, and like in theory, I like that idea, and in practice, it only sometimes works in this movie, I think.
Zach, do you have any thoughts that you didn't share the first time?
No, I still stand by like I'll be curious to see this on a second viewing. I don't know. To me, I'm just so exhausted by. I'm honestly really exhausted by the response to this. I was at work the other day and like somebody asked me, "Hey, did you see this?" And like I tried to gauge how I respond to stuff because I don't want to, you don't want to be
ruin somebody's fun.
Yeah, you don't want to. Yeah, you don't want to ruin somebody's fun, and so I'm just kind of like, yeah, no, I saw it. Like it was fine. Like it was, I enjoyed parts of it. It was good. And they like looked at me like I just said, like I just talked about how I like mutilated a cat and just left its corpse outside. I'm just like they like looked at me with like this, just disgusted look, and they're
how
just,
dare you?
How could you not love this? And I was like, I mean, like I get it. There's a lot going on. I'm not. This isn't dismissive, but I'm not like impressed by a bunch of stuff going on all the time, like
didn't you say off mic that he said it was the greatest movie he'd ever seen?
No, that just seems to be like it seems to be like it's either the greatest movie you've ever seen or you hate it.
It's the highest rated movie on Letterboxd.
How is that possible? Like more
the average is just
the average.
Is it just a recency bias? Like, do we wait a few months?
That's true. Yeah. Letterboxd, if you go to the highest rated movies, a lot of it is like Parasite, Lady Bird, Moonlight.
Well, and it's tough because those are the people using Letterboxd. So the people
the TikTok teens.
Who respond to those, like that makes sense. It also, and I get why it's been responded to really well, not necessarily because of its quality, but because to your point before, like it's unique and it's very like it's doing a bunch of stuff. It's very creative, and I think that we like because of the movie landscape at the moment is so deprived of any creativity. It's like this, I think, would be mid, but because there's nothing, it's just like it's the greatest thing of all time because it has so much more personality to it than any studio movie,
I will say I'm going to push back on that a little bit. I think this movie is like out there enough, like, and singular enough that it would stand out regardless of context. Like I can't think of a time in filmmaking history where this movie would have just like faded into the crowd. Like this is a movie that like kind of demands people to have a response to it. And, even if you go back to like whatever, like the heyday of American independent, like in the 90s or something like that, like, your typical Miramax slate or whatever at the time, like this is still like
those movies weren't this weird.
Yeah, the energy that this brings in, like it's like trying to command a stage, and I think that can be like really exhausting. But it's also like it's not. I don't think it's just because of the kind of like dearth of originality in cinema that people are responding to it.
I would say you can watch Putney Swope, and that's about as crazy as this movie.
Putney Swope is a good.
Yeah, but also that's like an all-time weird movie. Like you go to the late '60s, go to the Putney Swope time period, and Putney
Swope universe.
Yeah, like I don't know, like
crazy universe. All I'm saying is that again, like it's not. It's just more. My main takeaway is like just enjoy your movie and move on. Like it's a little aggressive.
You said, Zach, you were curious how it's going to hold up on a rewatch, and I wonder if this movie's stock is going to plummet because so much of the joy that people get out of it is the novelty, the surprise. Like
that's what I mean.
Cut to a new thing that you weren't expecting. Once you know the beats, is this fun to watch? I really don't know.
And that's what I want to know. Like that's why I say like I'm open to it. Could either I'll either not like it on the second one or I'll like it more. I don't know. It's one that I'm really really curious when you know how the mechanics work and you watch it that way, if it has any resonance.
Right.
See, I feel like when I watched it, I already felt like halfway through the movie I knew all the surprises anyway because they're so recurring. And
Yeah.
like because the movie feels so long, it feels like a movie that I don't really feel like rewatching. Even though I liked it, I guess in terms of like looking at our Letterboxd reviews, I think I'm the most positive on this movie of the three of us. But um, it's not a movie that I feel compelled to rewatch because it by the end it had felt like I had watched it twice already. And
put it on the poster. By the end, I felt like I had watched it twice already.
That's a lot of bang for my buck,
Michael
you know.
O'Malley Cinematary.
I mean, again, like I like the movie a lot, but I think that it already overstays its welcome the first time. And if people didn't feel like that the first time, I'm curious how they'll feel the second time. Because maybe they were just like swept up in it and will be swept up again. Because like by the end, things are recurring so much and circling around so much that you spend half of the movie with the surprises gone. I felt like, so I am curious to see like what its long term viability as like a top tier movie is.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's good on you if you like it. That's awesome. Enjoy it. I just, God, I just can't stand the like it's impossible to talk about this movie.
Yeah,
I actually like it. I like the discussion because it's been a movie that a couple different times, like people like when I meet people, people will be like, oh, hey, what do you do? Like, well, I'm a teacher, and like, you have that sort of conversation. Eventually, comes down to like, what are your hobbies? And one of the things I usually say is like, well, I watch a lot of movies, and almost inevitably, someone will say like, oh, I saw a movie the other day, and then they'll name a movie that either one I didn't like or two I haven't seen because it didn't look interesting. But multiple times I've had that sort of conversation where this movie has come up, and it's really nice that it has like broken through to a broader audience.
Yeah.
Because it is a movie that I feel like I can have a conversation about, as opposed to like, oh, sorry, I didn't see Spider-Man.
Sounds boring. Yeah.
Which is like what I've had to say a lot of different times. So I don't know. Like maybe I'm just not like as immersed in discourse as I could be, but I enjoy that this is getting like a broader reception because it means that I don't have to complain about Marvel to people.
So moral of the story is Michael likes this movie because it eases up his conversations that he has. See, what you got to do I just don't tell people I watch movies, and then I don't have to talk.
Maybe that's my mistake. I don't know what to say about myself then.
I just don't talk. It's wonderful. I just I just sit there.
Fair enough.
Just exist. All right. We're gonna just do that. We're just gonna sit and exist in the second part, I guess. Maybe I don't know.
That's right.
But we're gonna take a quick break, and then we'll be back talking about The Living End after this.
Good part one. We did it.
Good.
Let's see. I know what episode number this one is.
Have y'all?
I'm gonna go to the bathroom. BRB.
I will do the same.
I'll just sit here and vamp.
Oh man.
Are you going to the bathroom right now? Are you just going?
Yeah, just right on the bed. I got distracted because I've looked at this like a poster for The Living End on Letterboxd a lot of different times, and it just now occurred to me what part of the movie it's from, and it's like, who the fuck decided to make that the poster of the movie?
That's true. Oh.
All right. Andrew, you kind of look like when they interview someone whose identity they don't want people to know about on TV.
Yeah.
You're just like a silhouette.
Trying to, how can I make it even darker? I guess I could just be over here. Yeah.
You just need a brighter light behind you.
I have a lava lamp in front of me.
That's the
light is very minimal from the lava lamp.
Yeah, I'm not getting anything from the lava lamp.
I could maybe bring it closer. Let's see here. Ooh, it's warm.
Like lava?
Like lava. I'm not going to.
They say about lava, it's warm.
It is. As Amaleth found himself.
Man, that's so badass. Like that like fight in the volcano, like it is like 100% like video game boss like moment. I love it. I've been thinking about that a lot.
All right. Let's talk about what happens when a drifter and a film critic meet up and have fun.
I don't know how much fun they actually end up having.
No, not much. It's funny that they just were like, let's make him a film critic.
Well, wait, isn't this like halfway based on? It's based on a guy Gregg Araki knew, right?
I watched an interview with him on the Criterion channel, and he said that none of his movies are autobiographical.
No, I don't mean autobiographical, but dedicated to a film critic at the end, isn't it?
Who
died of
Zach did the fact
AIDS?
sheet.
Who's the like at the end of the credits?
I didn't see anything about it being, based on a film critic.
Well, I'm not saying that like the film critic went on a road trip with a.
No. But I don't think the character. I never saw anything about the character being based off of.
Okay, is dedicated.
Well, let's see. Does the movie have a dedication?
It does in the credits.
What's the name of the guy?
The scene where, or not the scene. In the credits at the end, it's like dedicated to like the hundreds of thousands who have died because of Republican fuckheads in the White House, especially. And then he like names a person.
Is that at the end of the movie or the beginning? I missed that.
It's at the very end. You have to like sit through the credits. Hold on, let me see if I can find it.
The credits. Man, Wikipedia does not have this information.
Not a lot. Hold on. I found a screenshot on Twitter, I think, which was linked in Letterboxd. I think. Hold on. Yeah, Craig Lee. Who is Craig Lee?
Craig Lee. He's a film critic.
I don't know. This is like bouncing around in my head, so maybe he's not a film critic. But that's the screenshot right there.
He's an actor.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he died in 91. Yeah, he died in 91. He's actually in The Living End. He's like a very, very small role. So I guess it was dedicated to somebody who died like before the movie was finished, because he died in 91 and it came out in 92.
Gotcha.
But he's like not a big deal in any way. Like his movies are pretty small and his roles are pretty small in them.
Okay. All right.
Okay. All right. Y'all ready?
Yes.
Here we go. In 3, 2, 1. And we're back with part 2 of episode 401 of Cinematary. In this part, we're going to be kicking off our Gregg Araki series with 1992's The Living End. Written and directed by Gregg Araki. The film stars John Garins, Marcus Hugh, and Jim Stark. A drifter and a film critic hit the road as fugitives and as gay lovers who are HIV positive. The Living End was one of the early films in the new queer cinema movement of the 1990s, comprised of movies by directors who were openly gay or lesbian. Those films generally portrayed protagonists who were open about their homosexuality and who confronted heterosexual norms. Often the pictures included graphic gay sex scenes. The Living End was the third film by Araki, but his first to receive wide distribution. Araki wrote the first draft of The Living End, which was originally titled Fuck the World in 1988, a time in which many gay men were dying from AIDS and few medicines were available to treat it. Although Araki tested negative for HIV, which causes AIDS, the specter of AIDS loomed over his life. Araki wanted to capture the desperation of the times, but when he completed the first draft, which ended with the death of both the lead characters, he felt it was too dark to produce and moved on to write his fourth screenplay, Totally Fucked Up, which eventually came out in 1994. Sometime later, Araki met producer Marcus Hugh at a gay film festival. Hugh had just co-founded Strand Releasing with producer John Garins and expressed interest in financing one of Araki's films. The writer-director revised the script for The Living End, and Garins lent him a sync sound camera as well as leftover Fujifilm from another shoot. The Living End was then the first movie that Araki filmed in color. The Living End premiered in 1992 at Sundance, garnering unprecedented media attention. But it didn't please everyone on its first release, even within the gay community. One of the biggest complaints was that it was anti-women, or more specifically, anti-lesbian.
What?
Yeah.
Where does that come from?
The scene in the car, is that the only...
Yeah, I think that's the one that they highlight.
Okay. They're not even like lesbian though. They're like, one of them is definitely bisexual. Whatever.
It's 90s. Fine. In 1992, the New York Times said, "Black humor doesn't get much darker than The Living End, the story of two HIV-positive young men who managed to turn potential tragedy into a desperate, uproarious celebration of their newfound nihilistic freedom. Doing himself a great disservice, the writer and director Gregg Araki labels his work, quote, an irresponsible movie, when in fact it has the power of honesty and originality, as well as the weight of legitimate frustration. Miraculously, it also has a buoyant, mischievous spirit that transcends any hint of gloom." In 1992, the Rolling Stone said Hollywood's gutless fear of AIDS movies makes this savagely funny, sexy, and grieving cry from the heart of writer, director, cinematographer, and editor Gregg Araki even more rending. And in 1992, the Washington Post said, "Crudely made and in your face, The Living End is mostly annoying."
Wow.
Yeah.
Washington Post canceled.
On that note, let's talk a little bit about the movie. I'll just kind of open it up to the room. I mean, what is y'all's familiarity with Gregg Araki? Because this was the first one I'd seen.
Yeah, I think Michael's maybe seen more than me, but Jesse and I think were the first in our circle to really start going down the Gregg Araki rabbit hole. We watched the movie Smiley Face with Anna Faris because it just kind of seemed like the kind of very silly, sort of effeminate comedy that we like to watch every now and then. The Anna Faris is often in them, like The House Bunny is another example of this. But that movie ended up like wildly impressing me with how
that movie rocks.
How like technically audacious it is. And I can't wait to get to that movie in our series. And then from there, we went to watch the movie Splendor, which is like such a beautiful, cute little like polyamorous rom-com that is like shot like a teen Nick movie or something, but it just like somehow just like exudes the best vibes possible. And we've watched a couple of others that we haven't responded to as well, but like this guy's filmography is really interesting. It's not that big, but he kind of like hops around between different genres, but is always very much like his personality is at the forefront of the movie, and his personality is very driven by music. This was a thing that was apparent to me before I was watching any sort of like interview content from him, but I did watch an interview on Criterion Channel with Gregg Araki, and he talks about like being really involved in the 90s music scene when he started making movies. And so things like shoegaze and post-punk music, Cocteau Twins and Slow Dive and people like that. He was very interested in like making that music sort of like the beating heart, like the driving energy of his movies. And that very much comes across to me. I feel like the music in his movies goes beyond just being like a soundtrack. It's not just like, oh, great needle drops in Gregg Araki movies. It's like, no, this is like the heart and soul of the movie. And as somebody who I really like that music, I think it's like extremely enjoyable to listen to. I think that his movies are kind of enjoyable to watch on a similar level, though I have mostly so far avoided the really difficult Gregg Araki movies. Like I know some of them are rough. This one is kind of rough. And I know Mysterious Skin is like a lot, and I plan on watching that along with the podcast. But Michael, you've watched some of those movies and some of the ones that I've seen as well. What is your read on Araki?
Yeah, I mean, I really like him, and I wouldn't have stumbled into his stuff without you guys, because I saw you guys watching that stuff, and I was like, oh, that seems interesting. And I don't know about y'all, but I more or less watched his movies in reverse chronological order, maybe, kind of. The first one I watched was Mysterious Skin, I want to say, which, as you say, is super rough. And then I kind of Smiley Face and Splendor are like much lighter and much more like fun by design, because they're not about ritual sexual abuse. But the like there was kind of like that unifying a shoegaze feeling, which I really enjoyed, as well as a unifying kind of like goofy, like go for broke, like camp sensibility, which I really enjoyed as well. And like those are all like, I think Splendor's like late 90s, and the other two are in the 2000s, like very firmly. And then I watched this movie, and this movie to me feels like from a different universe. It is much more informed by like the kind of 90s independent American cinema. Like at one point, like Sex, Lies, and Videotape gets kind of like referenced, and
there's somebody
like
wearing a t-shirt.
Yeah, it's like born of that moment where like
isn't
had a lot
that
of, like,
scene, the guy wearing the Sex, Lies, and Videotape t-shirt, one of the other guys who's like there to beat one of the protagonists up is also wearing a t-shirt with like a 90s indie movie. What is it?
He's a big old homophobe. He's gonna like beat up.
But like he has a t-shirt that has the name of like a 90s independent film on it. Do you remember what it is?
There's Sex, Lies, and Videotape. I don't remember the other one.
Man, I wish I could remember it.
But anyway, like this movie feels so much more of that. Like it feels less glossy and less smooth, and even the music is different. Like this is all like industrial metal in the soundtrack, and one of the characters is constantly referring to like the Smiths and like that kind of like punk like sort of stuff. But that doesn't really appear that much. It's mostly like Wax Trax stuff, like from that label, if you're familiar with that. So like it's really kind of abrasive music that we're constantly hearing, and I can understand like how this filmmaker got to making something like Splendor or Smiley Face, but I was really put like even like Mysterious Skin has that kind of like glossy like kind of ethereal feel to it that some of his other movies do, and whereas this movie is like grimy and like it has a really rough film grain to it, like the look of it, and the just the sensibilities of it are very like kind of scuzzy and on the road and like vagrant, compared to his other movies, which like toy with that sort of like vagrancy and free spiritedness, but always have like you mentioned, like the teen Nick aesthetic. And I think like the aesthetic makes those movies feel safer than like what the characters are doing. Whereas this movie has characters doing like things that are at least equally as dangerous, but the aesthetic doesn't make you feel like you're safe in the movie. And I was really put off guard, but I ended up really liking this movie. I think this is one of my favorite of his that I've seen. But yeah, I'm curious, like Zach, as someone who has not watched a Gregg Araki movie, how this came across, because I was definitely coming to this with the baggage of the other movies that I've seen.
I I mean, I don't know. I haven't seen the other ones. For this one on its own, I think I really liked how it leans into a little bit of just like that. I don't. It's not a lot John Waters, but just kind of like this. It felt very like this kind of unruly, independent '90s vibe,
Yeah.
but with like this, with the kind of this recklessness, or this not recklessness, but this kind of flippant attitude that like a John Waters movie has, where John Waters movies, it kind of has just like this like there's no bars kind of holding it, like it's you kind of can go anywhere, and this movie kind of felt like it could go anywhere, but it's like was built within the constraints of like a like a 90s indie movie, which
there's a running gag that feels very John Waters to me, as somebody who's not really a John Waters expert, but it's the thing where a character will be in a space by themselves and two people will walk by, one of them like holding the other by a leash. Yeah.
Well, and at one point they ask like for spare change or something, and they don't have any, and the guy's like, "You bunch of posers," and they just like get pulled off the screen.
But I mean, for the most part, I dug it. Like, I think it just kind of has like I was reading one blog that like specializes in queer cinema that was kind of putting this one, for whether it feels fair or not, like up against like something like Philadelphia, because of like how each handles like AIDS. And this one, I think this one, while it has like this flippant attitude I think it does really kind of capture just this just kind of the fear, like matched with just the anger,
much anger,
like the anger of this movie is really fascinating, and kind of just intoxicating to watch. A lot of the scenes that you could classify as like romance scenes between the two characters are like fueled by this anger and animosity to a degree, and it makes it less like romantic and more just like like increasingly uncomfortable. And it's not because of what you're seeing on screen, it's just because you can feel like this intensity that like, it's just kind of this cloud hanging over it that has nothing to do with their relationship. It's just more
it's like what's driving the relationship, right? These are characters who know that they're gonna die, and they don't know exactly when they're gonna die, but they're kind of like just acting as recklessly as possible, because what do they have to lose?
Right. Well, and their entire connection is based on that too. Like, these are people who would not really be sharing a space except for their like shared like sense of like impending doom.
And I imagine that like I'm not gay and didn't live through the AIDS crisis, but I imagine that finding a partner would be extremely difficult once you've tested positive, and like you might, and somebody please like write in and tell me if I'm wrong about this, but like finding a partner who is also positive might feel like a weirdly comfortable thing, because you don't have to worry about giving the other person, right? So these people are like clinging onto each other for dear life, so to speak.
Right. Although like there is like, what I think is interesting about the movie is like the two people who are the kind of central pair. Like, one is a guy who is like almost like purely nihilistic, right? Like, he is a movie who seems just like or not a movie. He's a character who seems unflappable because he has already given up the sense that he has any future. Like, he gives this whole spiel, like pretty early in the movie, about like how he's kind of like part of this doomed generation that has to pick up the consequences from the generation before him, and he thinks that like the powers that be are interested in like more or less like genociding gay people, and he's just like had to come to terms with that, where so he's like kind of like completely abandoned any idea of like conventional living, or like mainstream like bourgeois existence or whatever. Whereas the other person is like a film critic and like has personal connections with people, and is like more the person with a connection to the kind of it's not mainstream because he's like clearly still like within like a marginalized community, but like a
he's not untethered like the one
right.
character
Like he has a connection to living, and the like dynamic between these two is kind of like almost like an interior dynamic that I imagine might reflect someone who has contracted a disease where you will probably die at some point, where that like push and pull between like pure nihilism of like I'm completely giving up on any sense of finding like meaning and connection in life versus this desire to want stability, to want domesticity on a certain level. And I think that these two characters are really interesting as like almost psychological constructs, like commenting on that conflict.
What do y'all make of like the kind of characters that they come in contact with? Like because the world itself is kind of interesting. You have like the one character, the female character who's friends with the film critic one.
Right.
The other guy, the drifter, he interacts with different people and almost lives in kind of like this surreal world to a degree. I mean, you have like that whole scene where he's had sex with the guy and the guy's girlfriend comes in and then shoots him.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, there's 2 or 3 scenes back to back where this guy just like keeps coming across murderers. Like what this guy's
that's
living
a very
in a
John
different
Waters
movie.
feel.
Yeah.
But it's not the 70s anymore. It's not cool to be married to a bisexual.
Which is a great line. I thought that was funny. There was a lot of great lines in this movie. I thought like it just had a lot of throwaway things, but it's kind of like it's such a strange construction that I like because it's almost to a degree like they're almost the most normal because I mean like think of like the people you come in contact with. You have the guy who the drifter has sex with and then his girlfriend comes in and kills him. You have the two we mentioned before, the 2 women in the car who picks him up. You have like the whole interaction at the like the shopping mall. Like there's just like every other person in this world is kind of like almost this like surrealist cartoon like figure. And it's such a weird space to inhabit that between, the 2 of them together doing their thing and everybody else.
I watched the movie a couple of days ago. Maybe it was Sunday. I think it was Sunday. And we're recording this on Wednesday. And I don't remember most of those characters. Like, I just remember the 2 protagonists because, like, the movie is just, like, such their world, like, their own world. And, like you said, they, like, bounce off of these other people here and there. But these people barely make an impact because like these characters are so caught up in their own headspace. They're not like trying to make any meaningful connections, it seems.
And I mean, like I would imagine that's kind of like a function of living in a world that seems ambivalent or even hostile toward the idea of your existence, right? A lot of these characters that they interact with are characters that pose a threat to them. Whether it's like the random like psychotic homophobic people are gonna like beat the crap out of them, or like the person who's like very life is at threat because his wife will kill him if he quote unquote like relapses, like he mentions that like earlier in the scene.
Right.
And I don't know, like there's something really interesting about like the way that the rest of the world is portrayed as absurd and not silly because it's like menacing and threatening, but like bizarre. If the world doesn't care about you, like the world has to seem absurd and bizarre on a certain level.
Right.
Because that's the most natural thing is to like self-preservation. And once the world doesn't care about your preservation anymore, like it ceases to be working from the same point of view as you, and so it just is alienating. I mean, again, like people write in and tell me, a straight person, that I'm, wrong about this. But like,
I think that's true. I think that's
true because
intent.
that's what's fascinating about it, because I think it just kind of drops you in this space that it's not a right or wrong space. It's like you're describing. It's just the headspace of these characters, and they kind of have these conflictions within them that they're fighting, um, that kind of clouds everything. And to me, that makes it fascinating because you're trying to find like the not necessarily the truth, but just like the like it's something genuine, something real out of it. And a lot of the time it's just like you think of like the last scene of the movie, like it's just kind of this weird fucked up, like
Mm-hmm.
this was what this is kind of the realness of it.
Yeah, that's a really rough scene. Like,
Yeah.
how do we want to describe that scene? Is that a like rape / attempted suicide
I think
scene?
so.
Is that what's happening? Yeah.
That's probably the best way to describe
He's
it. Yeah.
described it previously in the movie where he talks about like the connection between death and an orgasm as being
Yeah.
like kind of chemically similar, and he'd like to die like as an orgasm.
Mhm.
And like at that point in the movie, the characters have become antagonistic toward one another, and yeah, it's super rough. And I don't know, like there's a thing that's even rougher about it, which is that like he can't kill himself, right? He can't die on his own terms, which I think is
Mhm.
that's the conversation they have earlier in the movie too, which is like they think about, this guy says like, I don't want to have to go through the symptoms of having AIDS. I don't want to have to linger on and go through all the anguish and pain that entails. So I'm just gonna kill myself, like before that can happen. And he
Mhm.
attempts to do that at the end of the movie and can't. And then like the last shot of the movie is just them sitting there on the beach after the gun has misfired, and just having to sit with the fact that they're not even allowed like the dignity of dying on their own terms. And I think that
Mhm.
like I don't know, it's really hard to watch, and
Yeah.
I can't claim to like have any sort of like insight into that like kind of like that headspace, but it feels like a very in the movie it feels presented very genuinely, and as
Mhm.
as like camp and snide as the movie can be, like that there's nothing about that in that scene, and it feels
Right. The emotional core of the movie is just like seething anger, right? And I like literally can't imagine that amount of anger.
yeah.
Because like we live in a world where there is treatment for stuff like this, right? For the most part. But like to feel like you and your entire community are just like facing oblivion, um, is just really, that's just a lot.
But to me, at least, I mean, again, I can't speak to it from that point of view. But like to me personally, it resonates because it seems much more true than like going back to the comparison with something like Philadelphia, like
Yeah.
doing kind of like this, like, for lack of a better word, like Oscar baity Hollywood like representation of that, where it's kind of like this is tough and these people acknowledge that it's tough, but in the end it's kind of like swoon Hollywood ending
The
that, like,
important thing is to empathize or
yeah,
whatever. Yeah.
exactly.
Right.
Like this one is just like, no, I'm just fucking angry. Like this is
Yeah.
fucking stupid and I'm fucking angry and I don't like that's just how it is. And like to
Mhm.
me, I'm like, yeah, that's like that's fine. Like we need that. That's great.
Right.
Like
Because
what
Philadelphia
else
does
what else are you supposed to be, in this situation?
Well, Philadelphia does that thing that a lot of like Oscar bait movies do when they try to like engage with serious topics, which is that like the protagonist of the movie is not the person going through the serious thing. The protagonist of the movie has to contend with the serious thing.
Yeah.
Like as a person looking outside in and find like empathy, not find a way to be an ally or have some sort of measure of compassion for someone. Whereas this movie is so embedded in the psychology of being the person experiencing the awful thing, and I think that is just such a fundamentally different kind of movie than
Mhm.
what Philadelphia or a lot of movies are.
Mhm.
Where you are not allowed any sort of like out from this perspective, like or the closest thing you have as an out from this perspective is the film critic's friend who keeps calling out of concern, like being like, "Where are you?" And that's like where she's left. Like the last scene that we see her is like her receiving a phone call from this guy who's worried about her. And that's the only perspective that we have outside of the perspective of like, I have contracted this disease that people seem completely apathetic toward trying to cure, and I'm going to die from it. Like that,
Right.
there's no escape from that except for the friend who is going to lose that person.
Right.
And I don't know, that's so raw and such an open like live nerve.
So I know that this movie is like operating on a very different emotional register than a lot of the later Gregg Araki movies, like Smiley Face or Splendor, for example. But I do think there is probably something connecting them, which is just like the emphasis on like people and relationships and like connections. And I also think that Gregg Araki is like very like unapologetic about the sexual connections between people being like a major factor of like how they experience joy with one another. And like the fact that joy also leads to like in the time period that this takes place in also leads to like devastation is like something that these characters like cannot wrap their head around, right? But I'm curious, Michael, as somebody who's seen some of the even rougher movies like Mysterious Skin, like how do the emotions compare? How does like the way he handles the subject matter of like really dark material compare?
Yeah.
Here?
I mean, I think with Mysterious Skin, like the arc of that movie is like two people who were abused by the same person in childhood, like finding each other and finding a sense of connection with that, which is in its own way beautiful. In the same way that like this movie, there is a kind of beautiful connection between these two people, who are both HIV positive, and so I think that that's like a common connection. As much as I mentioned earlier that this feels like this kind of like scuzzy like '90s independent cinema thing, I think that 90s independent cinema is known for like its irony and sarcasm and that sort of stuff. And Gregg Araki seems to like
very sincere, I think.
he anticipates the sincerity of much later film. And that's not to say there's not sincerity in any '90s film, but like the sense of irony only goes so far as like kind of shielding this beating heart in his movies. And so in that way, you have kind of, if you think of like the indie movement, American indie movement of the 2000s, it's a much more like openly sensitive and openly sincere kind of cinema than let's say like the like
Tarantino or Coen Brothers or whatever.
Yeah. Like those kind of guys who came up in the 80s and 90s and were kind of like the torchbearers then. And I think like this movie, The Living End, ends up feeling of a piece with his later movies in the extent that it is still foregrounding, like, you take these characters seriously in the sense of like they are human beings who are facing some really tough stuff. And through that tough stuff, there is a sense of connection, whereas like there are some like truly like just kind of like hip, cool, like nihilistic kind of like 90s independent cinema, like that someone like Tarantino kind of popularized. And I think that Tarantino himself is probably not nihilistic, but he definitely birthed a like kind of hip coolness above any sort of like personal connection kind of cinema.
Yeah, he kind of has like a South Park-esque like ironic detachment to any of the things he's talking about, right? It's like I'm above it. I don't need to get emotionally involved in what's happening here.
Yeah. Right, and you can see that like Gregg Araki is coming from a place that's like not unfamiliar with that because his movie is really bathed in, like as we've talked about, like these kind of distancing mechanisms. But I think that like one of the important things about irony is that it's oftentimes a defense mechanism against like a world that seems really hostile, right? And so the only sensible way to engage with that world is through detachment. And I think that unlike a lot of the other like contemporary movies of like the early mid '90s, this movie not only shows you the detachment, but kind of like understands the desire for connection within that detachment, kind of like the desperate need to find like another human being who can also share in your sense of detachment. Like in a weird way, it kind of reminds me of what's the Ghost World? Like in a weird way, it reminds me of Ghost World, with like two characters who are disaffected for completely different reasons than this movie. But the core of the movie is kind of the way that they navigate their connection with each other. And I think that this movie is that as well, where the disaffection, like the irony and stuff, is the immediate surface of the movie. But as the movie goes forward, you're kind of burrowing into, like, past that, into what is kind of like the humanity of these characters, which I think is consistent throughout his movies that I've seen.
Yeah, and I think I like that. I liked how they handled that, because I think too much nowadays, and this isn't just like a movie thing, I think it happens in like TV and such as well, but like there is like this kind of ironic defense where there is still like this genuine emotion and reaction to something, but there's like this wall in front of it of like irony, because just having like unfiltered emotion or an emotional response to it, not that it's like uncool, but like there's just something almost taboo to a degree.
No, I think it is. It's both taboo and uncool, or like the uncool label is tacked on to it to like hide the fact that it's actually taboo, right?
Mhm.
Like this is an experience that I have a lot showing movies to teenagers. Like when something really emotional happens on screen, a lot of times the impulse is to laugh. And I think that that's kind of a way of saving face, of like it would make me look weak if I had an emotional reaction to this. So I'm gonna distance myself by laughing at it. But B, I think like culturally we are, I don't know, maybe this is too broad, too sweeping of a statement. Like people don't want to like be emotionally affected by art, right? Like I think that is not what they're going to movies to experience for the most part. If
or
like,
at least some certain emotions, right? Like I think people will be pumped up or like euphoric about a work of art, and that's fine. But I think when we get to emotions like that we've internalized as negative,
right?
Because even the movie we talked about in the first part, Everything Everywhere, like that's a movie that does have like this emotional core to it, whether we agree with it or not, but it's coded in this irony. And so like that's how you get there. And like I think
when you get to leave saying like, oh, the hot dog fingers were so fun.
Exactly. And like I think about like how you're depriving yourself of something like the end of like Late Spring or Tokyo Story from Ozu, and like just the kind of melodramatic emotion that like Satsuko Hara has, where she just starts crying and puts her hands in her face on her hands.
You don't know what to do with that.
Yeah, and it's like, and it's such a kind of like forced response, but it makes sense in the context of the melodrama, and it's so emotional because of that. But I would be like devastated to watch that with a modern audience, because they would just think.
Oh, I've watched Tokyo Story with a room full of teenagers, and this is so off topic from the living end at this point. I apologize, but the class change happened like in the last 2 minutes of that movie. And I told the kids, like, if you want to stick around, I will email your next teacher and tell them not to count you late. But like most people left, and it was just like totally ruined the emotional resonance of the ending of that movie. And I was just sitting there like actually just crying.
Yeah, I would just be like, I thought in glass.
The moral of the story is Ozu should have used more hot dog fingers, I think.
Wow.
Yeah, that's true. I was telling somebody the other day that somebody asked me if like you could only watch like one director's, like if you like got some scenario where you can only watch one director's movies for the rest of your life, what would it be? And my pick was Ozu.
Man, I think that's too sad. I would not be able to pick Ozu.
I would be so happy in that. I would be so happy in that reality.
I would probably be a better person coming out of watching all those movies too.
That's what I think. I don't know how we got from get Gregg Araki to Ozu, but this is where we're at. That's why you come
Emotional
to Cinematary.
sincerity.
That's why you come to Cinematary, because we take you all over the place.
Going on a journey.
All right. Well, that'll wrap up this episode of Cinematary. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cinematary, on Twitter and Instagram at handle @Cinematary, on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/Cinematary, where we list all the movies that we talked about in this episode. If you'd like to support the show, whether $1 or $5, we'll take whatever you feel comfortable doing. You can go and do that at patreon.com/Cinematary as a street sweeper drives by. Thank you so much to our patrons: Cam, Chad Newsom, Corey Willingham, Candace Sisson, Ron Hayes, Teresa Marsathi, Titus Arthur, Tyler Chandler, and Whitney Rio Ross. Thank you so much for your patronage. Next week, we're going to continue our Gregg Araki series with a trio of films from 1993 to 1997 known as the Apocalypse Trilogy.
I think it's the Teenage Apocalypse Trilogy.
Teenage Apocalypse Trilogy.
Stoked. It's Totally Fucked Up is one movie, Nowhere is another movie, and I think The Doom Generation is the last one, which the only thing I know about that movie is that the title card says a heterosexual movie by Gregg Araki, and I can't wait to see what that entails.
All right. Until then, thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week.
Bye. Hey, Zach,